Hi folks, Rob Goller here. Thanks for joining me again for our weekly discussion of local history. I appreciate the support of this project as always, so thank you for joining me either live or when it plays back later. Some of you have asked about that. You said you're busy at 3 o'clock on Tuesdays. You can watch it anytime, so please spread the word about that if you happen to be talking about this. I had a friend come up and said, well, I have something going on at 3 o'clock on Tuesdays, and I said, well, you can watch it anytime. Either here or on Facebook or on the YouTube channel that I created in order to accommodate folks who don't like Facebook or who happen to not be on Facebook. So today I want to continue our discussion of politics and presidential politics. I had put this idea sort of on the back burner for later in the presidential campaign. As I had said previously, we have a lot of connections, weirdly, in our area, in the East Aurora area, to national and presidential politics in particular. As we talked about Horace Boyce recently, the almost president from East Aurora. Um, and there's some things that tend to happen that might be similar to other towns. So today is one of those where even if you're not from East Aurora, you don't even, you're not even interested in East Aurora history, it might pertain to whatever town you're in, a small town anywhere in the United States, particularly in New York State. This topic I was going to talk about a little later in the season, but it turns out that this week this is in the news with apparently Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has dropped out of the race for president and is endorsing former President Trump in the election. And Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was being talked about earlier in the presidential cycle here about whether, what his role would be in the election coming up. And then he kind of went away after Kamala Harris came into the race, and he hadn't been in the news. But this week he's back in the news, of course, because he dropped out of the race. So I thought, well, this is a good week to talk about it. Third parties. We often talk about Democrats and Republicans, but what about third parties? And I've studied politics and how we vote elections. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to that. And so I've delved probably more than is healthy into how we vote, presidential election results in general. So I've studied presidential elections here in our community, town elections in our community, town meetings that's used to how we used to do it back in the 1800s. I studied a lot of that for a variety of different articles over the past several years as the topics come up. And I've come across third parties quite a bit. And so I thought, it'd be neat to talk about it. Third parties have played a role, and if you were to read the newspaper at any given time, you might think, well, third parties had a pretty big role in our local politics, but as it turns out, they probably didn't have as big of a role as one would think. And usually I start from the beginning and come forward, but I think I'm going to go backwards because I want to end on probably the most significant third party we've had in our community. And I'll tell you that, so stay tuned for that. But third parties have actually had an impact. And I'm going to start with presidential races because that's what we're talking about here most recently. But as I studied and went back, and what I did at one point is I went back into all the old newspapers and any other sources I could gather to find out how the town of Aurora and the village of East Aurora voted in every presidential election, going back to the 1880s, I think it was, is the earliest I could document through the newspapers, and if there were other documents, other sources of record, I'd look that up too. But some of the third-party candidates that sort of rose to the top were in 1992, of course, with Ross Perot, and 1980 with John Anderson, and 1912 with Theodore Roosevelt. He had run on a third party after he was president, so in 1912 he ran. But only a couple of times were third-party candidates actually successful in garnering only more than a couple votes, and that was actually probably 1992 and 1912, where it really made a difference. 1992, actually, Ross Perot in the town of Aurora tallied 2,272 votes. That doesn't count absentees, but he actually tallied more votes than Bill Clinton in the town of Aurora. And at the time, town of Aurora tended to vote Republican. So George H.W. Bush actually won almost 2,800 votes, and Bill Clinton won just over 2,000, and right in the middle was Ross Perot at 2,272. Um, it's hard to tell where those votes would have gone if Ross Perot wasn't in the election, but so he actually did better in Aurora than nationwide or statewide. And it was kind of an anomaly that the third party candidate came in second place. I remember back in 1992 there was actually a grassroots movement here in East Aurora. There was a meeting, a rally in Hamlin Park during the presidential election for Ross Perot. So that might have had something to do with it. But in 1992, it seems that was a year that the third party candidate was quite successful, and actually, people here locally probably heard something from Ross Perot that they were looking for. So he came in second place in Aurora, which was over the Democrat, which was quite interesting to me. 1980, John Anderson. That campaign, a lot of folks who are my age or older might remember that third-party campaign. He actually did not really get a whole lot of votes. He got 639 compared to about 3,500 for Reagan, and to around 2,100 for Carter, Jimmy Carter. So more than other third-party candidates had gotten, but really not a lot to register. Certainly not the Ross Perot kind of candidate here in East Aurora, John Anderson. 1912 was actually one of the few years that the town of Aurora voted for a Democrat. And that was only because Theodore Roosevelt, who was on the progressive ticket, he came in second place. And so Woodrow Wilson won, and Theodore Roosevelt came in second place, and then William Howard Taft came in third, Taft being the Republican. And it is believed that Roosevelt pulled, because he was a Republican in his former life, pulled votes from William Howard Taft, giving Woodrow Wilson the election nationally. Now, that happened here in Aurora. So it was one of the very few times that Aurora voted for a Democrat, and that happened 1912, 1964 with Johnson, and then actually in the past several elections, a few elections since 2016, the town of Aurora has voted for the Democrat, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden. But Republicans had dominated the presidential election. So a third-party candidate in 1912 actually made a big difference in the election for president here. Now, 1924, interestingly, if you want to look back at a really interesting election, 1924, 100 years ago, you'll see a lot of things happening back then that are sort of rhyming with today. So definitely research that election if you're ever interested. But there was a third-party candidate, Robert Lafayette, who, again, got about 87 votes, I think it was, out of about 2,700 that were cast, so not a lot. So and actually it was believed that he pulled votes from the Democratic candidate at that point. Again, that third-party candidate was in the election, had gotten some votes here in East Aurora, but really didn't get enough to really make an impact. So you're really, the standard for a third-party candidate is Ross Perot, I would say, or Theodore Roosevelt in 1912, Ross Perot in 1992, Theodore Roosevelt in 1912. Now, probably, and then of course, again, there was and I'm checking my notes here because I've done a lot of research, but 1948 there was a progressive candidate, and they really didn't. Henry Wallace was a progressive candidate, and there was a socialist candidate that got about 43 votes. Henry Wallace, the progressive candidate, got 36 votes. Again, out of several thousand cast, that's not a lot. So the third-party candidates were reported in the newspaper, but they really didn't get a whole lot of traction. The socialist candidate probably got the votes that they did. I had checked back in the elections of the 1910s, 1920s into the 1930s, but around the 1910s, early 1900s, candidates like the socialist candidates garnered most of their votes from the election district that contained the Roycroft or the village. Show the people that were part of the Roycroft movement, which some of them had socialist leanings. And again, that's a whole nother discussion of whether Elbert Hubbard was a socialist. He certainly promoted some socialist writings, but he was also a capitalist. He's like a walking oxymoron, in my opinion. But in any event, that's probably where a lot of the socialists and some of the progressive vote might have come from. Now, probably one of the biggest, most successful third parties in the town of Aurora, in East Aurora, and in a lot of small towns like ours, was the Prohibition Party. And from the 1880s, 90s into the 1900s, they were a pretty powerful third party. And by powerful, I mean they put up a slate of candidates almost every year for both the national elections as well as the local elections. So whenever there was the town meeting, the town elections, you had the Democrats, the Republicans, and then the Prohibition Party. Now, the Prohibition Party, I was surprised to find out, actually still exists. You can actually look it up if you Google it. And Prohibition, of course, they actually were working toward prohibition, outlawing the sale of alcohol. That was their main focus. But they also had a whole slate of other topics, and their platform was quite extensive beyond the prohibition stance. They actually supported women's suffrage, and there was a whole host of other things. So, but the big thing that they supported was prohibition, of course, prohibition of alcohol. Now, they were a pretty powerful third party in the elections in that they didn't win any. The local candidates, I can't find where the Prohibition Party actually had a candidate that won, unless they cross-endorsed another candidate. So there were a couple instances where actually I found Democrats and Republicans that were at the town elections that the Prohibition Party cross-endorsed, and they won. But no one from who was running just on the Prohibition line actually won. And in fact, go through 1880s, 1890s, into the 1900s, every town election you look, they'd get a handful of votes, probably less than 1%. Same with the presidential election. They were getting less. They were tallying less than 1% here in East Aurora. What they did do, though, however, is the Women's Christian Temperance Organization was pretty powerful here in East Aurora. There was a chapter, and there were a couple ministers in town who were pretty active. Actually, Reverend Sales, who I believe was Unitarian, but don't quote me on that, was rather active. And he actually was a candidate for office for the Prohibition Party. So they were pretty powerful. But their power came in influencing policy and influencing the other parties rather than winning elections themselves. So what they did is actually, every time you go to a town meeting, there was in the 1880s, 90s, into the 1900s, and actually until we got to nationwide prohibition with the constitutional amendment, the town would vote on whether to be wet or dry. And there would be an election each year as to whether you would allow the sale of alcohol. And as we got later on, in the early 1900s, they would vote on whether alcohol could be sold at stores, hotels. They would separate it out. And so at the town meeting, they would vote. And women would actually come and try to influence the vote, the prohibition movement being a lot of women. And by the way, if you want to know more about the prohibition movement and how small towns impacted it, Ken Burns has his series on prohibition on PBS, and I just watched it last week, and it's pretty informative, and it's actually quite interesting how small towns played a role in the prohibition movement. And so now I look at how East Aurora, that prohibition movement and the Prohibition Party in our town, I look at it a little differently after watching that. So I highly recommend that. But at the meetings, the town meetings, the Prohibition Party would actually work with the Republicans and the Democrats and try to garner people to vote against the sale of alcohol. Now, the town wasn't, in many cases, later on they were voting on a proposition that said there shall be no sale of alcohol, or there shall be a sale of alcohol. But in the earlier days, 1880s and into the 1890s, you were voting on what was called an excise commissioner, or a commissioner of license, a license commissioner, who would issue the alcohol licenses. And outside of the political parties, Democrat, Republican, and Prohibition, there would be candidates for this license commissioner. And one candidate would be pro-license, and the other one would be no license. So you were voting for a candidate who would, depending on how you voted for the person, that would determine whether or not alcohol would be sold in the community, or if licenses would be granted. So if you were voting for the guy, and then it was a guy, who was no license, he wouldn't issue licenses for alcohol. So you were voting your opinion, voting your view through the person that was running for the license commissioner. So the Prohibition Party had influenced that, but they didn't necessarily put up candidates for it. But the Prohibition Party they were at the meetings. They were actually they had a ticket of people that would get that they would put forward, but in effect they were trying to pressure the town to vote against the sale of alcohol, not necessarily vote for their candidates, and also pressure the Democrats and the Republicans to vote with them on the issues. So the Prohibition Party was not necessarily successful in getting candidates elected, but their issues were pushed. So that's something interesting to think about today. That sometimes even if when you lose, you can make a difference politically, even by being the opposition, by being the third party. And so again, the Prohibition Party, even in the town elections, was far in third place. So they would have like maybe 1%, 2% of the vote, even in town elections. But they were successful for a year that I can find in the 1890s. I think it was 1893 or 1894, to have no license, no alcohol. Then the next year, the town went right back to the sale of alcohol. But it was very close. And they kept talking about how their movement impacted the sale of alcohol in the town of Aurora, even though they didn't win seats on the town board. And then, of course, the Prohibition movement, led to the national prohibition in the 1920s. So the local efforts kind of didn't matter as much anymore. But the Prohibition Party was pretty active. So much so that in 1900, the Prohibition candidate for President of the United States visited East Aurora a few weeks before Election Day. His name was John Woolley. And there was a picture that's been published over and over again of a rally, a campaign rally, a Democratic campaign rally in front of the Globe Hotel. And the Democratic headquarters happened to be right next door to it. And the caption for years and years was that the William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic candidate for a couple years during that time period, had visited East Aurora, and that was him speaking to the crowd outside the Globe Hotel. Well, as it turns out, it did look a lot like William Jennings Bryan. But as it turned out, it was 1900, and John Woolley and the Prohibition candidate for President of the United States and the vice presidential candidate came by train to East Aurora and spoke at the Opera House, which was at the corner of Church Street and Main Street. And that photograph we have of in front of the Globe Hotel is the Democrats holding their own rally in order to draw attention away from the Prohibition candidate who was speaking down the street. However, all the attention went to that Democratic rally because we have a picture of it. It was a huge deal to have the Prohibition candidate visiting East Aurora in October of an election year, the presidential election year. Now, the Advertiser covered it, the East Aurora Advertiser, the local newspaper, and so that's how we know. But there was a person here in East Aurora, Alice Hubbard, women's suffrage. Alice Hubbard hadn't come on the scene yet. It was 1900, but the Roycroft movement was gaining strength here in East Aurora. The movement of Albert Hubbard, women's suffrage, and all of the Prohibition. He was actually did not believe in alcoholic drink, and so I believe that may have had an impact on bringing John Woolley to East Aurora. This was before Albert Hubbard was really, really famous, but he did have some pull. He actually brought Susan B. Anthony to East Aurora at one point. So I think that had something to do with it. But that just gives you a sense of the impact of the Prohibition movement here in East Aurora, though it tallied small votes. It brought the presidential candidate in 1900 visited the village and spoke at the Opera House. So when I say that was probably the most successful third party here in East Aurora, that's what I mean, is that they had enough influence to bring the presidential candidate to East Aurora. There's been a couple other third-party things that have happened that are of note throughout our history. One of them, and when we talked about town elections, actually in recent years, the Republicans, and I've written about this, Republicans dominated town elections, town board elections, for decades, for more than 100 years actually, close to 150 years. But in the 1990s and into the 2000s, we had candidates who either by choice or they lost the primary, won their seats as third-party candidates. Norm Suttle being one of them in 1993. He was a registered conservative, ran on the Democratic line, but was not a member of the Democratic Party at the time. And so he won essentially as a third-party candidate, even though he had the endorsement of a major party. That was in 1993. Terrence Yarnell won. The same thing happened. He lost the Republican primary and won on, I think, on the independence line. Third party line won. And Jolene Jeffy did a similar thing when she became the first female town supervisor. She didn't win the primary, I don't believe, or did. But anyway, there's third party influences on the elections. The candidates either lost the Republican, and in this case Republican, or Democratic endorsements through the primary, but then ran on a third party and actually won their seats. So that's one thing. One part of the third parties that was important in our community is that the major parties dominated, but there are times where the third party candidates actually won. And finally, our village elections are pretty unique. In many villages, and villages are part of the town, incorporated governments within the town. We're unique in that the Democrats and Republicans have stayed out of them, officially anyway. Throughout the years, there have been some influences. But when candidates are running for the village board, they're actually running technically as third-party candidates. So the Democrats and Republicans in some communities, it's interesting, I'd go to other villages when I worked for newspapers, and they would have Democratic caucus or Republican caucus, and they would have candidates just like the town elections do. And it was a foreign concept to me because here in East Aurora we didn't have that. So without the Democrats and Republicans on the ballot in the village elections, each of the candidates picks their own party name. So today, you don't usually get a slate. Each candidate will, when they go in to file their petitions, they pick a party name and they pick a logo for their party. That doesn't usually get a lot of attention because it's the candidate we're voting for, usually in a village election. But they do have a party name next to their name, the candidate does, and a logo of their party. Now, back before probably the 1930s, 40s, they used to have slates of candidates. There was the Electric Party, there was the Good Government Party, so the village had like caucuses of people who had issues that they wanted to bring to the village board, and they would actually put a slate of candidates up. So they'd have a slate, but they were third party parties. So the Democrats and Republicans weren't on the ballot, but the Good Government Party was, or the Unity Party, or a party, bring electricity to East Aurora. So I think there was one time where it was an Electric Party. This is going back. And then probably one of the best examples of it, I think, was in 1994, when there was the potential for Walmart to come into East Aurora, and there was a group that was concerned about that. So they put candidates up for village board, and I think it was called Villagers for Responsible Planning, if my memory serves me correctly. And that was a third party, a slate of candidates, but a third party. And then that was unusual for the time because we usually didn't get a slate of candidates. But that's what has happened in the way past. Slates of candidates, third party candidates would come forward, but the Democrats and Republicans weren't part of that. So history of our village elections is really a history of third parties in our community. So So there's a lot of information there. I do plan to incorporate a lot of this into some book projects I'm working on. I have a whole section, I think, on elections. I find them fascinating, and from what I hear, people find them fascinating too, I hope. Just when you hear about the news coverage of elections, people are excited about elections and learning more about them and how they work. And third parties, both locally and nationally, are a big part of that. A lot of third parties gained their power, gained their popularity from grassroots movements, having rallies in local communities like East Aurora. And actually, there was Ron Paul spoke at the American Legion. I think it was before the 2012 election, and he was running for president, but he had run as a libertarian, so third party before, but at the time he visited East Aurora, he was trying to be the Republican candidate, Tea Party candidate, and had a rally in East Aurora. So technically his visit to East Aurora was not as a third party candidate, but still a big deal. So we had the Prohibition candidate, 1900, come visit, and we had a candidate for president visit in 2011. Or 12 before the 2012 election. So interesting history here in East Aurora with third-party candidates. Again, thank you for joining me. If you have any ideas or comments, please send them either through a private message or in the comments. Again, the numbers, I look at the numbers of people watching and it's ticking up, and I'm really happy about that. We're coming up to our 2 years of doing this, also our 100th video coming up soon. So I'm excited about it. I didn't know how this would work, but this seems to be going well, and I appreciate it. Able to share some of my research and get some feedback, and I've been getting some really, really good feedback. So I'd love to hear what you think about third parties and elections. Again, these videos are also available on YouTube, so check that out. Just search for my name, Robert Lowell Galler. And again, I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not affiliated officially with my duties as Town and Village Historian. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time, and thank you as always for keeping history alive. Take care.